Millions dead, battlefields soaked in blood, lives derailed long after the conflict ends. Would the departed approve of the reasons for the war? Would they deem those who stayed home worthy of their sacrifice? Welcome to Totally Random Horror Films. I'm Tom, and I have a really cheerful episode here for you today. In this series, I randomly select a horror film between 1895 and 1989 to review, and episode 9 is going to be a silent anti-war epic from 1919. Today's random selection is Abel Gance's J'accuse, which contains actual footage from World War I, and boy, do I have my work cut out for me on this one. I researched the usual places for information, as well as reference books Horror and Silent Films, a Filmography, 1896 to 1929 by Roy Kinnard, and Tome of Terror, Horror Films of the Silent Era by Christopher Workman and Troy Howarth. J'accuse, an essay by Robert Byrne on silentfilm.org, also was a resource, and a review at frenchfilms.org on J'accuse. The idea to include this film came from the Wikipedia horror film lists. It's mostly a melodrama, but there are enough dark concepts and imagery to include it in the conversation. J'accuse means I accuse, or I accuse you, or I condemn you. The characters in the film usually utter the words at the end of a scene of tragedy, sometimes at another player, sometimes at the audience. J'accuse was shot in France and was released on April 25, 1919. It wasn't released in the US until October 9, 1921. It is not rated. It's produced and distributed by Pathé Frères. The film has nothing to do with the open letter of the same name that was released in 1898 during the Dreyfus Affair, but was constructed by Abel Gance based on what he experienced and saw around him at the time. J'accuse is silent, black and white, and a whopping 166 minutes long. It is very easy to find on YouTube and can be downloaded from the Internet Archive. Unfortunately for us all, the film opens with some footage of the players, sort of like a television sitcom. It was World War I, and director Abel Gance was enlisted in the Section Cinématographique in order to film the conflict. He was discharged when he contracted tuberculosis. After letting the idea for J'accuse marinate in his brain for a while, he got financing from Pathé Frères and began work on the project. He re-enlisted in order to get footage of the battles, and Gance ended up filming parts of the September 1918 Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Additionally, he was able to get footage of over 2,000 exhausted soldiers returning from the front lines, and some of that footage is present in J'accuse, making the condemnation of war an excellent time machine. Before this, Abel Gance had only one other horror credit, 1912's Le Masque d'Horreur. After this, he would go on in 1938 to remake J'accuse as a talkie. Also interesting to note that Gance had an assistant director, Leigh Saundras, who lost an arm while fighting in 1915. Of the actors, not a single one ever starred in a film with horror-related themes, not before and not after. They had been performing mostly as stage actors. Romuald Joubert, who plays poet Jean Diaz, started film acting in 1911, doing lots of shorts. Ended up with almost 50 films. Séverin Mas played abusive husband François Laurent, made over a dozen films. Also, he appears to be an anamorph. Maxime Desjardins plays the officer father Maria Lazare and made 33 films. Maryse Dovray plays wife Edith Laurent and was involved with 45 films in her career. In the credits, they even included the child, Angèle Guise, whose character also shared the name Angèle, probably so the kid wouldn't get so confused as to what her name was. The version that made it to America in 1921 was edited, or more appropriately, emasculated for the US audience. Pacifism was not well received, so the film went from anti-war to nationalistic instead. The film also adopted a happy ending and spewed more vitriol about the Germans. Time for the review. First, the spoiler-free review. I believe it's likely that most people won't watch this film. If you don't plan on it, I recommend that you at least watch the spoiler review, as it will be showing some of the more striking footage. Jean Diaz is in love with Edith Laurent. Unfortunately, Edith's husband François is not too happy about it. The feud between the men is put on hold when they are conscripted to fight in World War I. Swept into the war machine, everyone both on the front lines and at home become victims of the senseless slaughter. When this film came out of the Tumblr, I thought, oh great, here we go. I've seen a few silent films and I've never really been a big fan. The longer they are, the more excruciating they feel. So when I saw J'accuse was almost 3 hours long, I started to dread doing this review right away. I'm happy to say I got sucked into the film. I still felt the 3 hours, but the film's cut into 3 segments, so I took a break, 10 minutes or so during each little intermission. I wanted to see what was going to happen. I knew there was real war footage involved in this, and the characters, though kind of two-dimensional, were interesting to me. Do I recommend it? Coming from someone who was dreading it and ended up fascinated by it, I must say I do recommend, but I'll give the same caveat as I always will with silent films. They do move slow, and the acting is over the top out of necessity. These individuals are stage actors. Their facial reactions and movements are exaggerated accordingly. Since they can't speak, they have to mime everything. If you're a mime, then you know that there's very little subtlety when it comes to miming. The ability to watch these and see the world 100 years ago also helps to keep my attention, so there's that, even though the film is almost 3 hours long, which I do not like. The perfect film is 80 to 90 minutes long, in my opinion. Also, be aware that there is a small amount of nudity, in case that makes a difference one way or the other. Now, the spoiler review. The horror in J'accuse comes from the horrors of war, obviously. The horrors and atrocities done in the name of a country. The spilling of blood of young and old. Devastation to the countryside. The broken remains of lives ravaged by grief. Well, that's just a war movie. Is that not enough for a horror film? Well, add to that the dead rising from their graves to march upon their own homes, you got something there. How about that title, huh? Those are all World War I soldiers. Ashes, ashes, they all fall down. Speaking of ashes, there's a big ring around the rosy going on in Provence, and some drinking and debauchery. I think the guy on the left there got lost in the sauce. Look at him booling out of control. Jean Diaz is a poet. All intelligence, all melancholy, all tenderness. France? Who lives with his mums, and he writes, creates art and music. He also receives portents from owls. Little owl's eyes. Peekaboo. Whoa there. Jean is also in love with the girl next door, Edith Laurent, but Edith is married to Francois, an abusive husband and part-time animorph. As stupid as Edith and Jean are to be ogling one another as Francois sits in the same room, it is overmatched by Francois' abusive nature, attempting to force his dog to drink the blood of a dead fawn. Francois catches his wife goo-goo-eyeing Jean, so yeah, in case we still like him a little, he also physically threatens his wife. That is, until her father comes in. Maria Lazare is a War of 1870 veteran and he itches to return to conflict. Yeah, Pops loves him some war. Yep. Dagnabbit, can't wait to get back to war. Jean Diaz has a notebook, emblazoned on the front is the very on-the-nose Les Pacifiques. He reads poetry to his mother, and today's offering is Ode to the Sun. I like what the film does here by showing images that his words represent instead of making us read the poem. Speak up, I can't hear you. Speak up, Jean. Speak up, Jean. 15 minutes into the film and we have some spousal abuse and brief yet tasteful nudity, depending on your tastes. Do we have to talk about the combination of spousal abuse and marriage without divorce? What is there to say? Everyone knows. The lovers meet in secret but are easily discovered by Francois. They are really not good at these things, like object permanence. Francois uses a gun to threaten his wife to go home. France has officially joined the war effort. People are running to sign up. Patriotism is high. Everyone is so excited to help out. Except Mother's not happy. Ashes, ashes. Nice superimpositions. The old-timers are finally getting what they want. Look at Maria's face. This is better than sex. And Les Pacifiques bears the sickle of the reaper. Death to the peaceful ones. Damn that owl. What's he thinking? Families are saying goodbye to their men and boys. Tension is high between Francois and Jean, as the poet gets to stay behind for a while after Francois ships out. and Jean starts to have visions of death. Concerned that Jean and Edith will have an affair while he is gone, Francois sends his wife to stay with his parents, even though it will be a more dangerous place to be. And here's Jean and his melancholy and his tenderness, looking at bleak war photographs. He looks at the audience. He looks at us. I condemn you. Pops is playing Stratego when he gets a text message. His daughter was brutally taken alive by the Germans. To avenge her, Jean begs to be called for active duty. He gives up everything and is willing to risk his life just for payback. He ships out and his mums wraps his cello in his jacket to remember him by. Word gets to Francois and he's none too happy to hear. He goes kinda nuts, writing letters in the middle of a battle, and getting miffed when they dare explode a shell nearby. Can't you see I'm writing over here? Comedy. And Francois is laughing now that Jean is the officer in charge. Not really, he's being a petulant snot, trying to disrespect Jean. More letters are written. The letter writing is becoming sort of a comedy, where one person suspects someone else of doing something, so they write a letter to a third party to ask them to ask the other person something. You get my drift. It's quite comedic, and I guess that lightens things up considering the mood of a war film. Why are you looking at the camera, Jean? Cut. Take 5. Pops orders Jean to send Francois, their best man, to reconnoiter a munitions depot on a suicide mission, but Jean goes himself. These guys are like the guards from Zelda. They have no peripheral vision. He sets a candle in some gunpowder, I guess. A begrudging friendship is starting to blossom. Dudes even reminisce about Edith in the middle of combat. I think this works as comedy, but not sure how it fits with the tone. I guess I expected an anti-war film to be more straight-laced when dealing with the war aspects. Know that there will always be beauty in the world, and that man will never be cruel enough to suppress it. Letter from a soldier. Skeletons dance around Sandro Botticelli's Primavera painting. The meaning of the painting is considered to be the growth of spring. Ashes, ashes. End of part 1. We see Botticelli again, and then we have this painting, and I can't find anything else about it, but if someone hasn't gotten a tattoo of this, then it's a crime. Jean is fatigued and has to go home on medical. He's seeing visions of owls and trying to interact with them. His mums is sick, so he goes home on the train. Here's a great view right here. The shot's a bit choppy, but hey, 1919. He gets home, his mums is dying, she wants him to read the poem, Ode to the Sun, just like old time. Don't do it, Jean. You know she's gonna die while you... Yep, she did. Now he's lost his mother, and he's still haunted by the loss of his dear Edith as everything dies around her. War kills mothers as well as sons. Of course, J'accuse. Word arrives, and here comes Edith. She's just been hiding, and she had a baby, and it's a 4-year-old. Feels to me like this child shouldn't be this old, but I'll forgive it. It appears that the Germans overtook the town that Edith was staying in, and they cornered her, and they had their way with her, and now there's Angèle. There are hints of Proto-German expressionism here, as it's not a stretch to say that this inspired Nosferatu. Anyway, if Francois finds out about what happened, he may kill the child out of a wound to his honor. Later, Pops leaves a note. He's tripping over it pretty bad, so he decides to leave town with a gun and go hunt some Germans for revenge. Jean agrees to keep the secret of Angèle from Francois. He also keeps the kid at his house. What a guy. Meanwhile, the child is playing around the dead mother. Edith finds that Jean has kept this from her and put her tragedy above his own. How he must love me. Jean's teaching the kid to be French by spelling the name of the movie. Francois, in his plague mask, gets word that his wife is home. Everyone else celebrates while he has a coronary. There's something strange going on with a dummy up here. Francois returns home and almost catches his wife with Jean. Nothing has changed, except Francois, who is now more capable of handling his emotions and seems to trust Jean. I assure you, it's nothing. Creaky pipes. The brute became a man. It looks like war made a better man out of Francois, and his wife doesn't notice or doesn't care. Love is like that. Francois finds his wife over here kissing the kid. He starts to lose it and accuse her of being the mother, but he calms himself down. He really trusts these people. Eventually, he finds toys in his house, not those kind, and then sets a trap. He tells Edith the child was killed, and she goes hysterical. It doesn't help that Francois roughs her up either. She runs off and finds that the child is all right, but too late, she's been found out. Francois is waiting for them to return to Jean's home and reveals he believes the child to be theirs. Fearing Francois will kill the child if he finds out about her origin, Jean remains silent. A fight ensues. In order to stop it, Edith has to fess up to what happened when she was captured. Francois nearly kills the child, or the doll. The doll was a priceless antique, I guess, so Edith faints. Francois decides to leave. Instead of killing the child, he, like Pops, will take vengeance. Francois is returning to the war. He tells Jean the truth, that he's uneasy with Jean around his wife. So Jean writes a letter to re-enlist himself. That's a heck of a sacrifice. The three have a relatively mature parting. The amount of character growth of Francois in particular is interesting. He still has abusive tendencies when enraged, but he's showing growth when it comes to coping skills and developing human understanding. End of part 2. We're deep into the war and everyone's a mess. Dirty, discouraged, and fed up with it all. Jean returns to command the men and their spirits are lifted. He rouses them with a call to arms and relates a vision. He's getting more and more of these visions. The Gaul is with them. Basically, the ancestors are riding with us. And the visionary told them other things, profound and painful things, which mustn't leave their muddy hell by way of images, because the eyes are still too far from the heart to truly understand. The children make Angèle wear a German hat and make her recreate their fantasy war scenarios. Obviously, the child is traumatized by the brood. Look at those monsters. They try to do something with crucifixion and Edith, the sacrificial cross which sums up all the French woman's pain. Before the battle, the men read the letters of the people they love and write their final letters home. Jean writes a bunch of letters and wants them sent to Edith a month at a time to postpone her from knowing about his death, at least a little longer. He hides these letters from Francois. Now we get to the battle, with footage from the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. This was the first involvement of the Americans in the war. They basically took out the Germans who were already attempting to withdraw. Anyway, it was a success. The Germans continued to withdraw until they were withdrawn, and the Saint-Mihiel salient was liberated. The footage of the battle is interspersed with the narrative. Jean is giving Mathieu the letters, but a shell goes off right next to them. Mathieu is gone, and Jean is shell-shocked. Really having a hard time of things. Head cashew at the nut house kind of stuff. He ends up giving the secret letters directly to Francois, and Francois doesn't freak out. He helps his friend get to safety. Then he goes back to fight. Condemnation! Fight and win! World War I footage! After the battle, Jean is like a total nutter, and somehow Francois is wounded in a bed right next to him. Francois agrees to send the letters as Jean desired. His bond with his brother has overpowered his jealousy and anger. Later, the kid and Edith are having a spot of tea when Jean comes in, unkempt, unshaven, and he has undergone a transformation since the beginning of the movie. While Francois seems to have gained some nobility, Jean has lost his marbles, and his appearance with it. He's on a mission to know the mental state of the country. That night, he steals around town and puts letters on everyone's doorstep. Why? Well, to invite them over to the following evening, of course, where they will bear witness to the resurrection. He starts to talk about his visions and explains, well, I'll just put it up here. Yeah, the resurrection. Everyone in the room is totally credulous and freaking out. And here we go. The dead are going to walk amongst the living, and there are some nice tracking shots in here. Double exposure as the ghosts of the dead are chasing Jean in his dream. And now we have to talk about reality. Let's talk about the Battle of Verdun. This was the longest battle of World War I, on the hills of Verdun in northeastern France. To oversimplify, France stood between Germany and England, and Germany had beef, so they invaded France to get closer to England. The first day of the battle, over 1 million shells were dropped on Verdun, and the Germans pulled out all the stops. Planes, flamethrowers, naval guns, you name it. The stops were definitely pulled out. England eventually reinforced the French army and they were able to repel the Germans, but after 10 months of war, roughly 700,000 soldiers were dead. That's 70,000 people a month. So in reality, we're watching 2,000 soldiers returning from the front lines of the Battle of Verdun. They'd have to go back within days, and most of them never returned. You're looking at people with death sentences. Here's a quote from Abel Gance. They played the dead knowing that in all probability they'd be dead themselves before long. Within a few weeks of their return, 80% had been killed. So back to the story. Why are the dead returning? Jean tells us, if you have been faithful to your dead, you have nothing to fear. Then he starts pointing out how some of the townsfolk have behaved while their loved ones were at war, sacrificing their lives. And here come the dead. They come to the windows, they come to the doors, they have messages for their loved ones. They deem that the townsfolk are worthy of their deaths, and this is a lesson for them to never take for granted the sacrifices made. Everything's over. Jean is so loony that Angèle has to teach him how to spell the name of the movie. It's kinda cute as you can see the actors struggling to make it look like the girl is the one in control. Jean finally returns to his old home and finds his old poetry book, Les Pacifiques. He reads his old poetry. The soldier in him had killed the poet, and he laughed at this fool who had once written poems about sunlit peace and the sweetness of life. Finally, we get the words to Ode to the Sun. Wait, O sun, before I go and disappear among the dead this night. And if my hand clutches at my windowsill, it is a bitter whimsy, out of preference to have died in the place of which I sing. I went there, a poet, festoons and astragals, genius beaming in my smile. I returned a soldier, a statue, a spectre. From my tomb I cry, pushing back the stone, as the earth itself would intone. Hear me in the name of those your splendor abused. Are you afraid? You blush vermilion. I was Jean Dias, but I changed my muse. My once sweet name is now J'accuse. And I accuse you, O sun, of illuminating a frightful bout, mutely, placid, undisgusted, like a horrible face with tongue cut out, of clinging to your azure balcony, sadistically watching till the final rout. And he dies, and the movie ends. Wow, J'accuse is a big meaty chunk of history and also showed the world what a film could do to inspire people's emotions. The London Times said, "The miracle has been achieved. A film has caused an audience to think." This film is mostly melodrama, but for horror fans it's worth seeing for the war footage, the dead rising from their graves, and some of the trickery with skeletons in the ring around the Rosie. The silent acting is some of the best I've seen. Admittedly, I haven't seen a lot, and I was able to follow everything that was going on. The film points a finger at those left behind and at war itself, but the actors never point a finger at themselves. Perhaps that's something that should be explored, but this has been quite a review, so let's end with another quote from the director, Abel Gance. I'm not interested in politics, but I am against war because war is futile. 10 or 20 years afterward, one reflects that millions have died and all for nothing. One has found friends among one's old enemies and enemies among one's friends. Okay, I'm Tom, and that was totally random.